Hey everyone, this is Johnny and welcome back. Today I'm going to be potting up quite a few Japanese maples. First of all, we're going to be potting up these little 4-inch potted Japanese maples, and we're going to put those in gallon containers. These of course were the ones that I pulled out of my yard last year, and I've shown you that process, how I find these in the mulched areas in my yard near my Japanese maple trees that are there. And then I pot these up, and about a year later, at this point when the stems get a little bit woody, that's about when I decide to go ahead and pot those up to a gallon pot. I'm also going to be potting up these ones that are in 2-gallon pots here. These have really outgrown these pots, and I like to aggressively repot these so they can be healthy and grow strong, and so we'll be potting those up. And then behind me I have some of these larger Japanese maple pots that were potted up, I believe, last year, but it's time to pot those up once again to a larger pot so they can grow and not be root bound in their pots. Now, as I pot these up, I want to talk a little bit about why I bother to grow seed-grown Japanese maples. Obviously, as I've mentioned in past videos, when you are growing maples from seed, they're not going to be true to the mother plant. And so what's going to actually happen is you're going to get a lot of variation. You're going to get a variation in color, you're going to get a variation in leaf shape, and you get some that look very normal, just generic, maybe like a blood good, just a red. And then you get some that have cool shades of green, and pastel-y colors, and you get a lot of variation. You also get variation if you grow the tree out to its larger form, you know, one that you could put in the landscape. You also get a variation in how big that tree grows. One of the main reasons why people like to propagate Japanese maples with grafting or cuttings is because you get a very uniform color of leaf, characteristics like if you have a variegated leaf. You also can predict the height and the width of the plant, and so if you're putting that plant in the landscape, then of course that's important because you don't want that tree to get too big for a particular spot. So I understand why that's important, but why I bother to grow these is because several reasons. One, because of all the unique colors that you get. For instance, like this one here, you can see how this was quite red earlier in the season, and now it's got some green with red on the margins there on the edges. That's a beautiful one. Then we have one like this one. This particular one is quite green, but you can see the veining is red, and so that's a pretty tree. It's kind of got a sawtooth edge with almost a feathery end. I like that one a lot. Then you have one like this that is almost more pastel. It's got a more pastel color as it fades to some green coming out. That's a good looking tree. Now I've shown some of these in the past, but once again here, kind of pastel-y colors. You have ones like this that just look pretty standard, like a blood good, just a standard red leaf. You have one that goes a little bit more towards the lace leaf variety, not quite lace leaf, but you can see some of the genetics of the lace leaf variety in there. And just because of this the uniqueness of this, I really like to grow these from seed. Another big reason why I like to grow these from seed is because some of the ones that are less remarkable, these particular ones are remarkable, these are nice, these are not going to be this example, but if you grow some of these by seed and they look very similar to a blood good, or they look very similar to just a standard green Japanese maple, they make great grafting candidates. So if you're looking for grafting rootstock, you can grow your own grafting rootstock from seed-grown Japanese maples and just sort out the ones that aren't particularly exciting or just are kind of generic, and then you can graft onto that rootstock a specific variety, which I definitely plan to do in the near future, and I'll take you through that process. So let's go ahead and pot some of these up, and we'll move along through these. So definitely I got this one at a good time. It's not root bound. You can see some of the roots along the edges, but it's definitely not root bound. This particular one has a cool, like almost variegated look to it as it's fading into the green. It's kind of like green splotchy with red. That's a cool looking tree for sure. And basically I fill these pots somewhere around 3/4 or so with the potting soil. People have asked what kind of potting soil I use. I use various different kinds of potting soil. It really doesn't matter. I use just a general garden potting soil. Nothing specific as far as you don't need to look for anything specific. I use organic, but anything that is a potting soil that you can use with normal plants should be totally fine. I've used G&B organics in the past, and obviously potting up's pretty simple, but you just stick it in after filling that pot with 3/4 of soil, and then you make sure that you fill in the rest of that to where the soil was naturally growing before. Give it some slight pressure to make sure that there's no air around the roots, and then that one's ready. So I'm gonna go ahead and pot up the rest of these in 4-inch pots into gallon containers, and then we'll catch back up with you. Okay, just potted up the last one there. I think I have just a little bit over 30 that I've potted up here, so quite a few. Um, As far as how I'll take care of these, I will not fertilize these till next year. These have plenty of nutrients in this potting soil. This is a good organic potting soil, plenty of nutrients for these potted plants. I'll make sure that these Japanese maples stay out of direct sunlight as far as unfiltered light. They need light, obviously, but I make sure that they're under a shade cloth, something that'll keep them from that bright afternoon sun. You can see that a few of these have just a little bit of damage where maybe some water got on the leaf and then the sun hit it and it made the little white spots on it. For the first part of the season, I had these in direct sunlight, and then I've recently moved them over to shade cloth. But you just want to make sure that these get watered. You know, depending on your climate, here where I am, I water these roughly every 2 days, but I check them if they're still wet. The soil's still wet, I don't water them still. So now that I've done all these gallon containers, I'm gonna go ahead and move over and pot up just a few of the 2-gallon pots that I have as well, and then we'll move on to the big pots. All right, so we got all those 4-inch pots potted up to gallon containers. Now I want to move these these 2-gallon containers to 3-gallon containers so they can stretch the roots out, keep them from getting root bound. As I pot these up, I also want to talk a little bit about what got me into Japanese maples in the first place. And I'd love to hear from you as well. So I'll share my story with you, and I'd love to hear from you what got you excited and what got you into Japanese maples. But basically, you know, when I was younger, I wasn't into gardening that much. And I liked plants, but plants weren't a big part of my life. But when I moved to our current house, there were a few Japanese maples in the yard. And I just love the beauty of the trees, the color, the beautiful red colors. When I started noticing that there were little trees growing underneath, the little seedlings growing underneath the tree, of course, I love the beautiful parent plants. That first year, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know how many I planted up, but I transplanted a number of them into just 4-inch little pots. And those came through the winter, and that next spring they started doing well. And come around March, April, when I started seeing them again, I dug up the little seedlings and put up some more. And over the last several years, it seems like every year, at least the last 3 years, I've probably potted up like over 100 each year just from my yard. And this has actually grown to be really a love of mine. I love Japanese maples now. I love growing them. And I especially love the propagation process. One of the cool things about being a gardener is to be able to multiply your trees. So obviously the trees produce seed-grown Japanese maples, which will be quite different. I've shown you in the past cuttings how you can take and cut off a young softwood branch and stick that in medium and get some of those to root. And then of course you can propagate by grafting. But you know, just being able to create plants from the plants that you already have, of course, non-patented varieties, but being able to do that is just, it's incredible and it's a lot of fun. And so I got started because I moved to a house where there were Japanese maples. I love the beauty of them. I started growing them from the little seedlings that grew up under the trees, and then I was hooked. Let me know what your story was. Maybe you specifically went to a garden center and you saw them, or maybe your story is like mine. You had a house with a landscape that had one in it. But that's my basic story, and one of the main reasons why I got into Japanese maples in general. And I hope to do quite a bit more growing in the future. I hope to one day be able to sell trees, have a little bit of a nursery of some kind. So I just got one more to do here, and then we'll move to the big trees behind me. You can see that these particular trees are just starting, they're not root bound, but they're just starting to get roots here on the edge. So this is the perfect time. All right, there's those 3 potted up. Now I want to move to the big ones behind me, pot those up to their larger pots. Okay, the first larger tree that I want to pot up is this Alarian. This particular one, I believe, was potted up last year. And I believe when I pull this out, this will probably begin to be root bound. So it's definitely time to move this up from this particular container, which I'm not sure what this is, maybe a 10-gallon container, and I'm moving it to a 15-gallon container. Same potting soil that I used with the 1-gallon containers. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pull this out of the old pot. It looks like it's beginning to be root bound just slightly. It's not too bad, but it's just starting to be. So I think I caught it perfectly before this gets too root bound and unhealthy. Just kind of loosen it up just slightly. Looks like there's a snail, dead snail in there. Just loosen that up. Make sure those roots know they can move to that new soil. I'm gonna put that in. That's about right as far as the height goes. And then I'm gonna go ahead and fill this in with soil around this. I can definitely see, we had gotten some rain over the last several days, but I can definitely see that these are drier than I wanted. So I definitely need to make sure that I water the trees today. You wanna make sure that your Japanese maples stay as evenly watered as possible. They don't like to be waterlogged. It's good to have a soil that drains very well. But at the same time, you do need to keep them somewhat moist, and an even watering is best. You don't want to, have you don't want to have a bunch of periods of dry and then wet and then dry and then wet. That's not going to be good for the tree. You want it to be as even as possible. All right, well, that tree is going to be a lot happier in this larger pot, and this particular one will be able to grow a lot larger here. Eventually, I'd like to have this in the landscape, but for now, I'm trying to grow it out as healthy as possible, once again, by potting them up pretty aggressively and making sure that they don't get root bound. Let's go ahead and move to the second variety, which is a blood good variety. All right, the next tree that I have here is a blood good variety that's in a number 5 container, and I'm just going to move that up to the slightly larger container that I just pulled the Alarian out of. We're gonna put that in here. This particular one was actually grown from a small little grafted blood good that I bought at a local nursery. And I've had it, I believe, somewhere around 3, possibly 4 years or so. And it's grown very nicely into a beautiful tree. Obviously a very common variety blood good, but a beautiful tree, and I want to make sure that it stays healthy. Also, in this particular size right now, it's getting a little bit top heavy and the wind was starting to blow it over. So it's definitely time to move it to this larger pot. This one definitely has a little bit more roots on the edge here, but it's not root bound yet. And fill that in. All right, so that blood good, I believe, will be a lot happier in this larger pot. Next year, I'll probably go ahead and move it up to this larger size, but for now, I believe for this season, that'll be good, and that will provide the roots a little bit of room to grow and move. All right, so there you have it. I potted around 37 Japanese maple trees up today, and I hope you enjoyed. Follow along with me. Now I just have to figure out some of these, my space where I keep my Japanese maple, where I keep them under shade and a shaded cloth, it's getting a little tight. So I'm definitely going to have to rethink my space a little bit. I have limited space here in my backyard to be able to grow these. So I'm definitely going to have to rethink that a little bit. I'll probably take you along with that journey as I kind of redesign my space and I maybe build some new benches or some new ways to protect these Japanese maples. But if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please consider subscribing. If you did like the video, please consider clicking that like button. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.